Sit down and be quiet. You have no idea who you're sitting among. The words hit me so hard I actually forgot what I was about to say. For a second, I just stared at my husband. Derek was smiling when he said it. That was the worst part. Not angry, not drunk, not out of control. Smiling like he'd made a harmless joke. Around us, crystal glasses reflected the soft light from the chandeliers hanging over the ballroom. A few people at our table gave uncomfortable little laughs. Others suddenly found something interesting on their plates. I felt heat rise into my face. And then, something happened that changed the course of my life. A man sitting 3 seats away stopped chewing. He looked directly at me, gnawed at Derek, at me. His eyes narrowed slightly. Then he reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his phone. For several seconds, he scrolled through something. Then he froze. "Oh my God," he whispered. The room went quiet. The man turned his phone toward me. "Mame," he said carefully. "Is this you?" I looked at the screen and my stomach dropped, because I knew exactly where that photo had been taken 6 months earlier in Oklahoma. Standing in mud covered in dust. Tired enough to fall asleep standing up. And suddenly I wasn't sitting in a luxury country club outside Colorado Springs anymore. I was back in one of the hardest weeks of my life. But before I tell you about that, I should probably explain how I ended up at that table in the first place. My name is Rachel Mercer. I'm 42 years old. I spent nearly 15 years in the Army working logistics before transitioning into nonprofit work. These days, I run housing programs for veterans, military widows, and seniors who need help staying off the streets. It's not glamorous. Most days involve paperwork, county offices, phone calls, funding requests, and trying to solve problems nobody else wants. I love it. But it isn't the kind of job that impresses people at fancy charity galas. At least, that's what my husband liked to remind me. The gala happened on a Saturday evening in late October. The event was being held at a private country club near the Broadmoor in Colorado Springs. The guest list included wealthy donors, business executives, retired military officers, foundation leaders, and local politicians. People who wore expensive watches without talking about them. People who knew which fork to use without thinking. People who seemed perfectly comfortable in rooms like that. I wasn't one of them. Honestly, I hadn't wanted to go. My left knee had been bothering me all week. An old service injury. The weather had turned colder, and every step reminded me of it. I'd also spent the previous 3 days dealing with a housing emergency involving an 81-year-old veteran whose landlord had sold the property with almost no notice. I was exhausted. The only reason I attended was because Derek insisted. "We need to show up together," he'd said. "People trust family-oriented professionals." That should have been my first clue. Not we, not us, not let's have a nice evening. Number. We need to show up like I was part of a presentation. A prop, a visual aid. I didn't see it clearly then. I do now. The ballroom looked beautiful when we arrived. White tablecloths, fresh flowers, a small jazz trio near the stage, servers moving quietly between tables. Everyone smiling, everyone networking, everyone selling something. Derek fit right in. He worked for an investment firm that specialized in development projects and community partnerships. Over the last few years, he'd become increasingly obsessed with status, the right contacts, the right events, the right people, the right image. Somewhere along the way, he started looking at life like a business opportunity, including our marriage. At first, the comments had been small, easy to ignore, easy to explain away. But lately, they had become harder to miss. That night started the same way. Within 15 minutes of sitting down, Derek was already introducing me to people, but not really introducing me, editing me. "This is my wife Rachel." He smiled. "She used to be in the Army." Used to? As if those years no longer mattered. As if they had expired. Then came the second part. Now she keeps busy with charity work. Keeps busy. Not runs programs. Not helps veterans. Not manages housing initiatives across multiple counties. Keeps busy like I needed a hobby. A couple people nodded politely. Nobody knew enough to realize what he'd just done, but I knew. I felt it. The same little sting I'd felt dozens of times before. Still, I stayed quiet. The evening moved on. Dinner was served. Conversations shifted from business to philanthropy. Someone at our table asked about affordable housing for veterans. Housing? My area? Something I actually knew. So, I answered, or at least I tried to. We've seen a huge increase in seniors needing. Derek laughed and lightly touched my arm. Honey, maybe let the adults handle the money talk. The table chuckled. I felt my jaw tighten. Derek continued. You know, logistics was always more your thing. More laughter. Not loud, not cruel. Just enough. Just enough to make me feel small. I looked down at my plate. Part of me wanted to push back. Part of me wanted to stand up and leave. But another part, the tired part, just wanted to get through the evening. So, I said nothing for a while. Then someone asked another question, this time directed at me. A retired Air Force colonel wanted to know whether local nonprofits were struggling with rising housing costs. I started answering again, and that's when Derek leaned closer, still smiling, still looking perfectly pleasant to everyone else. And he said the sentence that changed everything. Sit down and be quiet. His voice was low, almost friendly. Then he added, you have no idea who you're sitting among. I remember hearing a fork touch a plate somewhere nearby. I remember feeling my chest tighten, and I remember thinking something I never expected to think about my own husband. He actually believes that. He really believes I'm beneath these people. Then Frank Dalton looked at me, pulled out his phone, and asked the question that would unravel everything Derek had spent years building. Ma'am. He turned the screen toward me. Is this you? I stared at the photograph, the muddy field jacket, the destroyed senior center behind me, the exhausted face I barely recognized, and suddenly every eye in the room was on me. Not Derek, me. For a few seconds, I couldn't say anything. I just stared at the photo on Frank Dalton's phone. The image had been taken during the tornado response in Oklahoma back in April. I remembered that day clearly, not because of the picture, because of the smell. Anyone who's ever been through a major disaster knows what I'm talking about. Wet insulation, broken lumber, gas leaks, mud, everything mixed together into a smell that stays with you long after you leave. In the photo, I was standing beside what used to be a senior center outside Elno. Half the roof was gone, the parking lot was covered in debris, and I looked absolutely terrible. My hair was tied back with a rubber band. My jacket was stained with mud. There were dark circles under my eyes. Nobody would have called it a flattering picture, which made Frank's reaction even more confusing. I looked up at him. Yes, I said slowly. That's me. Frank leaned back in his chair. For a moment, he looked almost relieved. My goodness, the people around us exchanged curious looks. Derek forced a laugh. You two know each other. Frank shook his head. No, we've never met. Then he looked at me again. But I've seen her before. The room became noticeably quieter. Even the conversations at nearby tables seemed farther away. Frank held up his phone. This photograph was included in a disaster housing report our foundation reviewed earlier this year. I blinked. Our foundation funds emergency housing and recovery projects all over the country. Now people were listening carefully. Frank Dalton wasn't just another guest. Everybody in that room knew who he was. A 74-year-old Texas businessman. Oil money, real estate, philanthropy. The kind of man who could write a check and change an organization's future overnight. He wasn't flashy about it, but people listened when he spoke, including Derek. Especially Derek, Frank continued. There was a tornado recovery project in Oklahoma. He nodded toward me. Your face stood out. I laughed awkwardly. Trust me, that wasn't my best look. A few people smiled. Frank smiled too. No, ma'am. But it was memorable. Then he turned toward the others at the table. The local response systems were overwhelmed. Volunteers were stretched thin. Resources were delayed. He looked back at me. But every report mentioned the same thing. I felt my stomach tighten. I already knew where this was heading. And honestly, I hated being the center of attention, Frank said. There was one person coordinating everyone. I immediately shook my head. It wasn't just me, he pointed gently. See, that's exactly what the report said. Laughter rippled around the table. The friendly kind. Not the kind that makes you feel small. The kind that makes people lean closer. I wasn't sure what to do with that. Derek jumped in. Rachel's always been modest. His smile looked a little strained now. She's involved with a small nonprofit. They do good work. Something changed in Frank's expression. Not anger. Something quieter, more dangerous. Curiosity, small nonprofit. Derek nodded. Nothing huge. Frank folded his hands. Interesting. The single word landed like a pebble in a still pond. Derek's smile tightened. Frank continued. Because that's not what the report suggested. Nobody spoke. I suddenly felt bad for Derek. At least for a second. Then I remembered the comment he'd made less than 10 minutes earlier. The pity disappeared. Frank looked back at me. Can I ask you something? Sure. The Oak Ridge relocation project. How many residents did you move during the first week? I was surprised he knew the project name. 37. His eyebrows lifted. You remember? I almost laughed. Frank, one of them was a 9-year-old widow who refused to leave until someone found her cat. Several people smiled. The cat made it, by the way. That got a bigger laugh. Frank nodded. What about temporary housing? We partnered with 2 churches and a community center. What about medical equipment? A local pharmacy donated supplies. We used volunteer drivers. What about transportation? Mostly veterans helping veterans. Now people were fully engaged. Not because of me, because of the stories. Stories are what connect people, not resumes, not titles, not job descriptions. Stories. I found myself talking about things I hadn't thought about in months. The retired Marine who wouldn't evacuate without his oxygen machine, the elderly couple who spent 53 years in the same house and cried when they saw the damage, the National Guard volunteers who worked through rainstorms, the church ladies who somehow produced enough casseroles to feed half the county. By the time I finished, nobody was looking at their phones anymore. The room felt different, warmer, more personal. Across the table, an older woman with silver hair watched me closely. Her name was Marlene Dalton, Frank's wife. She reached for her water glass. Then she asked something that hit harder than I expected. Can I ask you a question? Of course. She tilted her head slightly. Why has your husband never mentioned any of this? The table went completely silent. I felt Derek stiffen beside me. My heart dropped, because I knew there wasn't a good answer. The truthful answer was complicated. Derek had mentioned my work, just never like this, never as something meaningful, never as something worthy of respect. He usually described it the same way people describe a hobby, something nice, something harmless, something secondary. I looked down at my hands, then back up. I suppose it never seemed important. The words tasted bitter. Marlene's face softened. I think she understood more than I said. Women her age usually do. They've lived long enough to hear what's missing from a sentence. Frank slowly placed his phone on the table. Then he looked directly at Derek. Not aggressively, not accusingly, just honestly. That's surprising. Derek forced another smile. How so? Frank's voice remained calm. Because your wife's work is one of the reasons my foundation became interested in housing partnerships in Colorado. The air seemed to leave Derek's body. I saw it happen. Just a flicker, a tiny crack, but it was there. For the first time all evening, he looked uncertain. A man who always had the right words suddenly couldn't find any. Around us, conversations resumed, but our table had changed. People weren't asking Derek questions anymore. They were asking me, and for the first time in years, nobody was interrupting my answers. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt strangely sad because sitting there listening to strangers show more interest in my work than my husband ever had, I realized something. This wasn't a bad night. It wasn't one rude comment. It wasn't one embarrassing moment. It was a pattern, One I'd been making excuses for far too long, and deep down, I knew the hardest part of the evening hadn't happened yet. After Frank said my work was one of the reasons his foundation had come to that gala, nobody knew quite what to do with the silence. It wasn't dramatic. No one dropped a glass. No one stood up and pointed a finger. This was Colorado Springs money, after all. These people were trained from birth, or at least by their second marriage, not to react too much in public. But the shift was real. You could feel it. Derek sat beside me with one hand around his water glass, squeezing it just a little too hard. His smile stayed in place, but it looked pasted on now, like one of those family Christmas photos, where everybody knows the couple is fighting in the car. 5 minutes later, Frank asked me another question about the housing program. Then a retired Air Force colonel across the table asked about county partnerships. Then Marlene wanted to know how we found elderly veterans who didn't trust government agencies. And suddenly, after years of being summarized by my husband in one sentence, I was being allowed to speak in complete paragraphs. That sounds small. It wasn't. I answered carefully at first. Old habit. Don't take up too much room. Don't make Derek uncomfortable. Don't sound like you're bragging. But the questions kept coming, and they were good questions, real questions, not the kind people ask when they're waiting for their turn to talk. The colonel, whose name was Warren Hughes, had thick white eyebrows and a hearing aid he kept adjusting every time the room got loud. He leaned closer and said, "How do you get veterans to accept help when they're too proud to ask?" I smiled because that one I knew. "You don't start with help," I said. "You start with coffee." He looked amused. The coffee or a broken porch step or a ride to the VA, something practical, something that doesn't make them feel like a case file. Warren nodded slowly. My brother was like that after Vietnam. Wouldn't take a dime from anybody. Most of them won't, I said. Not at first. Marlene looked down at her hands. My father was the same way near the end. He'd rather sit in a cold house than admit the furnace was out. That's common, I said, especially with older men. They don't want pity, they want dignity. The word dignity landed harder than I meant it to, maybe because I had been thinking about my own. Derek shifted beside me. Rachel's always had a soft spot for sad stories, he said. There it was again. Soft spot. Sad stories. A neat little way to make the work sound emotional instead of professional. I turned toward him. Not sharply. Just enough. They're not sad stories, Derek. They're people. His face flickered. Just once. Then he gave that tight little laugh I knew too well. Of course that's what I meant. But it wasn't. And for the first time all night, other people seemed to know it, too. That's when the memories started coming back. Not all at once. More like old receipts falling out of a drawer. 2 years earlier, Derek and I had gone to dinner with a couple from his firm at a steakhouse downtown. The kind of place with leather booths, dim lights, and waiters who recited the specials like they were reading scripture. The wife asked me what I did. I opened my mouth. Derek beat me to it. Rachel used to be Army, he said. Now she runs one of those feel-good veteran programs. Feel good? Like we were handing out balloons. I remember smiling because that's what wives do when they're trying not to ruin dinner. On the drive home, I told him it bothered me. He sighed like I'd asked him to carry a refrigerator upstairs. Rachel, come on. I was making you sound interesting. Interesting, not respected. Not capable. Interesting. Another memory came right behind it. A Tuesday evening in our kitchen. I had just gotten home from PBLO after spending 9 hours trying to keep an elderly veteran from losing his apartment. My feet hurt. My back hurt. I still had dust on my shoes from the man's driveway. Derek was at the counter with his laptop open eating takeout from a cardboard container. I told him the man had almost been evicted because he didn't understand a notice from the property manager. Derek didn't even look up. Another rescue mission, he said. You know, not every sad story needs you in it. I remember standing there with a grocery bag cutting into my fingers, too tired to answer. That was how it happened in our marriage. Not one big cruelty, 1,000 little edits, A word changed here, a laugh there, a correction in public, a silence at home. And after a while, I had started shrinking before he even asked me to. Back at the gala, a woman named Beverly Parks sat down beside me during dessert. She was somewhere in her late 60s, beautifully dressed with a cane hooked over her chair and a diamond bracelet that probably cost more than my first car. She said, "My son-in-law talks over me like I'm a toaster. I nearly choked on my coffee," she shrugged. "I'm serious. I built 3 accounting offices before he learned how to spell mortgage. But now that I need help reading small print, he acts like I came free with the furniture." I laughed because I couldn't help it. So did she. Then her expression softened. "Don't let him do that to you too long, honey." I didn't ask who she meant. I didn't need to. Derek saw us talking. He stood up too fast. "Rachel," he said, "can I borrow you for a minute?" Borrow? Like I belonged to the table. I looked at him. Frank did too. Before I could answer, Frank said, "Actually, Derek, I was hoping Rachel could explain the transition housing model to our group before the program starts." Derek's jaw moved. No sound came out. Then he smiled. Of course, but his eyes were different now. Warning eyes, the kind he gave me at parties when he thought I was saying too much. For years, that look had worked. I would soften my voice, change the subject. Protect him. Protect us. That night, I looked away first, but not because I was backing down, because I was starting to see him clearly, and it hurt. A few minutes later, a woman from Frank's foundation mentioned Derek had been very enthusiastic about an advisory board position connected to their housing initiative. I turned my head. Advisory board? Derek went still. The woman blinked, realizing she'd said something she shouldn't have. "Oh, I assumed you knew." I looked at my husband. He adjusted his cufflink, a tiny movement, but I knew him. That was his tell. Suddenly, the whole evening made sense. The expensive suit he'd insisted on buying, the way he'd coached me in the car not to get too detailed about my work, the way he told me to smile and let him lead the conversation. He hadn't brought me there as his wife. He'd brought me as evidence. Proof that he was connected to veterans' housing. Proof that he cared. Proof that he deserved a seat closer to the money, but only if I stayed small enough for him to stand in front of me. I sat there with my coffee cooling in my hand, and something inside me went very quiet. Not numb, clear. For years, I thought Derek had been careless with my story. That night, I realized he had been using it. I should tell you something about myself. I can handle emergencies. A tornado ripping through a town, a housing crisis, a veteran sleeping in his truck behind a grocery store. Give me a checklist and a deadline, and I'll find a way through it. But put me in a ballroom full of wealthy strangers and make me talk about myself. I'd rather clean storm debris for 12 hours. After realizing why Derek had brought me to the gala, I excused myself and stepped into the hallway outside the ballroom. The corridor was quieter, soft carpet, framed photographs of Colorado landscapes. A few guests passing by on their way to the restrooms. For the first time all evening, I could hear my own thoughts. I leaned against the wall and rubbed my knee. The ache had been building for hours. A familiar reminder from my army days that getting older doesn't ask permission. The door opened behind me. I turned. Frank Dalton stepped into the hallway. Marlene followed him. "Everything okay?" Frank asked. I laughed softly. "Depends how you define okay." That earned a smile. Marlene pointed toward my leg. "Knee?" I nodded. "Old injury, honey. These floors are murder on bad joints." I laughed. "That's exactly what my physical therapist says." "Your physical therapist is smarter than most people." That made me laugh again. And honestly, I needed that because my emotions were all over the place. Embarrassment, anger, confusion, relief, grief, some strange combination of all 4. Frank leaned against the opposite wall. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then he said something that completely caught me off guard. "Rachel, I owe you an apology." I blinked. "For what?" I should have connected the dots sooner. I frowned. "I don't understand." Frank folded his hands. My foundation has been reviewing housing proposals for months. I nodded. That wasn't surprising. Housing projects required money. Money required donors. Donors required paperwork. Lots of paperwork, Frank continued. One proposal kept coming across my desk. I already knew which one he meant. The Veterans Housing Initiative Derek's firm had been pursuing. The same project my nonprofit had spent nearly 2 years helping build. Frank looked directly at me, and every time I reviewed it, your name showed up. I felt my stomach tighten, my name everywhere. His voice remained calm. Matter of fact, the county contacts, the volunteer records, the partnership agreements, the church coordinators, the local contractors, the veteran outreach teams. He shook his head. Every road led back to you. I didn't know what to say, because honestly, that wasn't how I thought about the work. When you're in it every day, you stop seeing your own fingerprints. You just focus on the next problem, the next deadline, the next family who needs help, Frank continued. But every presentation we received painted a different picture. Now I understood, and I didn't like where the conversation was going. Derek, I asked quietly. Frank nodded. Your husband never outright lied. That hurt more somehow because it sounded exactly like Derek. Not lying, just rearranging the truth, leaving pieces out, making certain details larger, making other details disappear. Frank sighed. He positioned himself as a key connector. My chest tightened. He talked about partnerships, funding, strategy, growth. Frank shrugged. Important things. Then he paused. But when we actually examined how the project got built, he smiled gently. You were everywhere. The hallway suddenly felt very warm. I looked down at the carpet. Part of me wanted to disappear. Another part wanted to cry, not because of praise, because for years I'd wondered whether I was imagining things, whether Derek really minimized me, whether I was being unfair, whether I was too sensitive. Those words again, too sensitive. Frank's next sentence answered that question forever. I don't think your husband understands what you've accomplished. My throat tightened. Marlene quietly touched my arm. Just for a second. The kind of gesture women understand without explanation. No pity, just recognition. Frank looked almost embarrassed. Then he said, "Can I tell you something funny?" I wiped one eye. "Please," he chuckled. "Half our board assumed Derek was your husband." I stared at him. "I beg your pardon," the supportive spouse. I laughed. A real laugh this time. The kind that sneaks up on you. Frank laughed too. Marlene covered her mouth. For a moment, all three of us stood there laughing in a hotel hallway. And honestly, it felt wonderful. Not because Derek was being mocked, because for one brief moment, I saw myself through someone else's eyes. Not through Derek's. Not through my own doubts. Through the eyes of people who only looked at facts, the work, the results, the relationships, and apparently, they had reached a completely different conclusion about who mattered. When the laughter faded, something heavier settled into its place. Fear, because eventually the evening would end. Eventually, Derek and I would get into the same car, drive to the same house, sleep under the same roof. I knew my husband. He hated losing control of a narrative. And tonight, the narrative had slipped completely out of his hands. Frank seemed to read my expression. "You okay?" I hesitated. "No." It felt good to tell the truth for once. "No." I stared out a nearby window. The mountains were barely visible against the dark Colorado sky. Beautiful. Neither of them interrupted, so I kept talking. I spent years making excuses. He's stressed. He's ambitious. He doesn't mean it that way. I laughed bitterly. Turns out he meant it exactly that way. Frank looked down for a moment, then back at me. "You know what I think?" I shrugged. "I think you've spent so much time helping other people stand up, that somewhere along the way you forgot you were allowed to stand up too." That one landed hard, because it was true. For years, I'd advocated for veterans, widows, families, people who deserved better. Meanwhile, I kept accepting less than I deserved inside my own marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me. Frank glanced toward the ballroom doors. "There's something else." I straightened. What? We'd like everyone to hear from you. I immediately shook my head. No. The answer came so fast it surprised even me. Frank smiled. I thought you'd say that. I'm serious. So am I. Marlene nodded. People need to hear what the work actually looks like. I crossed my arms. My hands are shaking. Good. I stared at her. She smiled. That means you care. I looked toward the ballroom. Toward the room where Derek sat. Toward the people who had spent years hearing his version of our story. And suddenly, I saw him through new eyes. Not powerful, not intimidating, just a man who depended on everyone else staying quiet. Then the ballroom doors opened. Derek stepped into the hallway. The second he saw us, he stopped. His expression hardened, not publicly, just enough. A warning, the same look I'd seen for years. The look that said, Don't embarrass me. Don't challenge me. Don't make this difficult. For the first time, it didn't work. Frank looked at me, waiting. So did Marlene. I took a slow breath. My knee hurt. My heart was racing. My palms felt cold. But something inside me had finally shifted. I looked directly at Derek, then back at Frank. Okay, I said. I'll speak. And for the first time that night, I watched fear cross my husband's face. The walk back into the ballroom felt longer than it actually was. In reality, it couldn't have been more than 20 feet, but every step seemed louder than the one before it. I could hear my heels against the floor, feel my heartbeat in my chest, see dozens of conversations happening around the room, people laughing, servers carrying trays, a donor telling a story near the bar. Normal things, ordinary things. Yet somehow everything felt different, because this time, I wasn't walking in as Derek's wife. I was walking in as myself. Frank entered first. Marlene followed. I came behind them. The room gradually settled as people noticed. Frank didn't make a grand entrance. That wasn't his style. He simply stepped toward the small podium near the front of the ballroom and tapped a spoon lightly against his water glass. Conversation slowed, then stopped. Folks, Frank said, smiling warmly. Before we continue with the evening, I'd like to take a few minutes to recognize someone whose work has had a bigger impact than most people in this room realize. Immediately, every eye turned toward me. I wanted to disappear, not because I was ashamed, because I wasn't used to being seen. There's a difference. Frank motioned for me to come forward. My legs suddenly felt heavy. Still, I walked up. The room applauded politely as I reached the front. I noticed Derek sitting near the center table. His smile had returned, but it looked strained, like he wasn't sure what came next. Honestly, neither was I. Frank stepped aside. The microphone waited. I stared at it for a second. Then I looked out at the crowd. Retired generals, business owners, widows, community leaders, people in their 60s, 7s, and 80s, people who had lived enough life to recognize sincerity when they heard it. I took a breath. My name is Rachel Mercer. A few people smiled. I continued. Frank asked me to say a few words. Small laughter. The tension eased slightly. The room relaxed. So did I. I should probably start by saying that I'm not very comfortable talking about myself. That earned several knowing nods, especially from older veterans. I recognized that look, the look that says good. Neither are we. I smiled. I'm usually much more comfortable talking about the work. And then I did exactly that. Not the awards, not the accomplishments, not the numbers, the people, because that's what mattered. I told them about Harold Jensen, a 76-year-old Vietnam veteran I met 3 years earlier. Harold lived in his pickup truck for nearly 6 months after medical bills drained his savings. Not because he lacked options, because he was embarrassed. He didn't want anyone to know. I told them how we finally convinced him to accept help by asking him to help another veteran first. That got a few smiles. Then I talked about Carol Whitaker, a military widow who spent 40 years raising children and supporting her husband's Army career. After he passed away, rising rent nearly pushed her out of the apartment she'd lived in for 12 years. Not because she was irresponsible, because life got expensive and loneliness got heavier. Several people in the audience nodded quietly. Some looked down, others stared straight ahead, listening, really listening. I kept going. I talked about the Oklahoma tornado, the damaged homes, the church volunteers, the exhausted first responders, the seniors who refused to leave without family photographs, the veterans who showed up with chainsaws before anyone asked. And then I said something I hadn't planned, something that simply came out. Most people don't need help because they're weak. The room grew still. They need help because life hits them from 3 directions at once. Nobody moved. Nobody checked their phone. Nobody whispered. I continued. A medical bill, a storm, a lost job, a spouse passing away, a bad fall. One thing becomes 2. 2 become 4. And suddenly someone who spent a lifetime taking care of everyone else is sleeping in a car. Several people wiped their eyes, including me. I paused, collected myself, then smiled. The good news is that Americans are still pretty amazing. That got a few chuckles. It's true. I've seen retired plumbers fix roofs for free. I've seen church ladies organize enough food to feed entire neighborhoods. I've seen veterans who barely had enough money for themselves show up to help someone else. Now the room was smiling, not because the stories were funny, because they were familiar. People recognized themselves in them, or someone they loved. I looked across the room directly at Derek, then away again. Not because I was afraid, because this wasn't about him anymore. It was about truth. I stepped away from the microphone. The room remained quiet for a moment. Then applause began. Not explosive, not dramatic, warm, steady, genuine. I returned to my seat. Frank stepped forward again. Thank you, Rachel. He waited for the applause to settle. Then he said something that changed everything. For the sake of clarity, I'd like everyone here to know that our foundation intends to continue discussions regarding the Veterans Housing Initiative directly with Rachel Mercer and her organization. Silence. Pure silence. Then came another round of applause, louder this time. Several people stood. Not many, a handful, but enough. Enough to make the point. I glanced toward Derek. His face had gone completely still, the kind of stillness people get when they're working very hard not to show emotion. His jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the table. Across the room, several donors were already speaking with Frank's team. Not Derek, Frank's team. The shortcut Derek had spent months building had just disappeared, and everyone knew it. A few minutes later, Derek stood. He lifted his glass, forced a smile, and said what was probably the smartest thing he could think of. Rachel and I have always been a team. The room went quiet again. People looked at me, waiting. For years, I would have smiled, nodded, protected him, made things easier. The old instinct showed up immediately. I felt it. Then I remembered every introduction, every interruption, every dismissal disguised as a joke. I stood, not angry, not emotional, just calm. I looked at Derek, then at the room, and said, "No, Derek." My voice surprised me, steady, clear. I think tonight it's important to stop confusing support with control. Nobody spoke. The sentence hung there, simple, impossible to argue with. For a second, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then Marlene started clapping. Frank joined her. A retired colonel followed. Then another guest and another until the entire room was applauding again. Not for a clever comeback, not for revenge, for honesty. Derek sat down slowly, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked small. A few minutes later, his phone lit up on the table. The screen faced upward. I wasn't trying to read it. Neither was anyone else. But sometimes life has a strange sense of timing. The preview message appeared. "We need to talk Monday." Frank's office called from his boss. The man sitting beside him accidentally saw it, an older gentleman in a navy blazer. He coughed into his napkin, then quietly muttered, "Well, that's unfortunate." A couple people nearby suddenly became very interested in their coffee. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing, not because I enjoyed his pain, because after years of being underestimated, The universe had finally decided to submit its own performance review. And it wasn't favorable. When I looked at Derek again, something had changed. The embarrassment was still there. The anger, too. But underneath both, I saw something else. Fear. Because he finally understood something I'd only just realized. Myself. He didn't control my story anymore. People always ask what happened next. The truth is, nothing exploded. There wasn't some dramatic divorce announcement. No one threw suitcases onto a front lawn. Nobody screamed. Real life is usually quieter than that. The biggest changes often happen after everyone else goes home. The drive back from the gala was one of the longest drives of my life, not because of distance, because of silence. Colorado Springs looked peaceful that night. Street lights, late traffic, the mountains disappearing into darkness. I sat in the passenger seat looking out the window while Derek drove. For almost 20 minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "You embarrassed me." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because after everything that had happened, I couldn't believe those were his first words. I turned toward him. "That's what you took from tonight?" His jaw tightened. "You made me look like some kind of villain." I stared at him, then looked back out the window, because suddenly I understood something. Derek wasn't hearing me. He wasn't hearing anyone. Not Frank, not the donors, not the people I helped, not even himself. He was hearing damage to his reputation. Nothing else. The rest of the drive passed in silence. When we got home, I slept in the guest room. For the first time in our marriage, oddly enough, I slept well, not because I was happy, because I was tired of pretending. The weeks that followed were uncomfortable. At first, Derek acted as though the gala had simply been an awkward evening, a misunderstanding, something that would fade if nobody discussed it. But reality had other plans. About 2 weeks later, Frank's Foundation officially announced it would work directly with my organization regarding the Veterans Housing Project. That wasn't revenge. It was efficiency. We were already doing the work. Now the paperwork finally reflected it. The decision created ripple effects. Not dramatic ones, professional ones, the kind adults understand. Meetings shifted, phone calls changed. People who once returned Derek's messages within minutes suddenly took longer. The advisory board position he wanted quietly disappeared. Nobody publicly blamed him. Nobody humiliated him. They simply moved forward without him. And for a man who built his identity around access, influence, and connections, that hurt a lot. At home, things became harder because public consequences are easy compared to private truths. One evening in January, Derek knocked on the guest room door. I was sitting on the bed reviewing housing grant applications. He stood in the doorway holding 2 mugs of coffee. For a moment, he looked like the man I married, the man from years ago, before everything became about image, before every conversation felt like a performance. "Can we talk?" I nodded. He handed me a mug, sat down, took a long breath. "I'm sorry." I waited, maybe unfairly, maybe hopefully. But I waited. Then came the rest. "I'm sorry you felt embarrassed." There it was, the sentence, the escape hatch, the difference between regret and accountability. I looked down at the coffee, then back at him. "You still don't understand." His shoulders sagged. "I do understand." "No." I shook my head. "You understand the consequences." His face hardened, not angry, defensive. The expression of someone who thinks effort should count more than results. I was trying to build something for us. I had heard versions of that argument before. Always dressed differently, always meaning the same thing. I looked at him carefully, then answered, "No." The room fell quiet. "You were trying to build something on top of me." He stared at me, and for once, he didn't have a response ready. That conversation changed everything. Not because it solved anything, because it revealed there was nothing left to solve. The man sitting across from me still believed intentions mattered more than impact, still believed success excused behavior, still believed my hurt was secondary to his goals. I finally stopped arguing. not out of surrender, out of clarity. Over the next few months, I met with a counselor, then an attorney, then another counselor. I spent long evenings walking through my neighborhood, trying to imagine a future I never expected to need. Starting over at 42 wasn't part of the plan. Some nights I felt strong. Other nights I cried in my car after work. I worried about money, loneliness, failure. I wondered whether leaving meant I hadn't tried hard enough. I wondered whether all marriages eventually become disappointing. Healing isn't a straight line. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. Eventually, after 3 months of separation, I stopped asking whether leaving made me a bad wife. I started asking whether staying would make me abandon myself. That question was easier to answer. A year later, the Veterans Housing Community Center officially opened. Nothing about the building was fancy. Honestly, that made me love it more. There were folding chairs, bulletin boards, a coffee station that never seemed completely full, a small medical consultation room, meeting space for support groups, transportation services, housing assistance offices, a place people could actually use. The ribbon-cutting ceremony happened on a bright spring morning outside Colorado Springs. Frank and Marlene attended. So did county officials, volunteers, veterans, families, people who had spent years making the project possible. The crowd wasn't huge, but it was real. That mattered more. As I walked through the building afterward, I saw an elderly widow signing up for transportation assistance, 2 Vietnam veterans arguing about football, a retired mechanic offering to repair another resident's walker, someone complaining about the coffee, someone else complaining about the chairs, which honestly felt perfect because people only complain when they feel comfortable enough to stay. Frank wandered over and handed me a cup of coffee. Quite a day. I smiled. It is. He looked around the building, then back at me. You should be proud. A year earlier, I probably would have changed the subject, minimized it, redirected credit. But I had learned something since then. Pride and arrogance aren't the same thing. So, I simply nodded. I am. Frank smiled. Good. After he walked away, I stood in the lobby for a moment, watching people move through the building, talking, laughing, finding help, finding community, finding each other. And I realized something. The most satisfying part of my story wasn't seeing Derek lose influence. It wasn't the applause at the gala. It wasn't watching powerful people finally recognize my work. The most satisfying part was remembering that my value never depended on someone else's permission. Not Derek's, not Frank's, not anyone's. I spent years believing respect was something you earned by working harder, staying patient, and keeping the peace. But respect is also something you protect. Sometimes the person sitting closest to you becomes the last person willing to see your worth. That doesn't change your worth. It only means you may need to stop waiting for their approval. If you're listening today and you've ever had to rebuild your confidence after someone spent years chipping away at it, I hope you remember this. It's never too late to reclaim your own voice. And if this story meant something to you, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I hope you're taking good care of yourself.